Everyone, good to see you all. Today is going to be learning Lishma, okay? That's my warning. My warning is that there's a lot of numbers, and we don't have the time to properly unpack all the numbers, and therefore this is going to be not your favorite shir. Just putting it out there, okay? Because we're just going to basically. Wow. Okay. Okay. Not my favorite shir. Okay, bottom line is there's going to be a lot of numbers. We're not going to be able to unpack the numbers. So we're going to be doing a little bit of trusting on the numbers because I don't think we're going to be able to get through the Amud.
I'm a statistician, mathematician.
Fantastic.
So
Okay, no, good luck. Okay, that's fine. Okay, and there's going to be a review share given by the two of you, okay, or Jesse. Okay, okay, fantastic. Okay, so here we go. So we are on 82b4, okay, and again, please excuse me as we go through a lot of numbers which are not going to be unpacked fully because again, we're just not going to be able to get through the Amud without it, and that's the way it's going to work. Okay, so 82b4, column 1, the first column. Rav Yo in the middle of the first column. Rav Yochanan ben Broka Omer. So we had in our Mishnah, if you remember. There was Rav Yochanan ben Broka and Rav Shimon, who both gave different measurements for the amount of bread that's needed for the Eruv food. Remember, we need to have 2 meals, and that's the halacha. Halacha is that it has to have 2 meals. And then the Gemara asked, what's the quantity of these 2 meals for the Eruv? Rav Yochanan ben Broka said, it is a loaf which is purchased for a pundyan when 4 sa are purchased for a sela. Okay, you can understand already why we're not going to get into all the details. But the point is, that's a good question. Inflation sort of exists. We'll see some allusion to inflation. They didn't have, I believe, a sophisticated way of explaining inflation, but there is some level of inflation. They don't discuss it like the philosophy behind inflation, why inflation is happening, but they do certainly acknowledge that there are changes taking place over time. Okay, and there's an acknowledgement that there's general change over time, which we'll see, but they don't. Yeah, so there isn't an acknowledgement of inflation in general, which confuses things because they as opposed to nowadays where we'll use inflation, we'll say, okay, well, it's just changed. Over there, they'll only use certain time periods where they'll measure again, they'll reassess what the values are, and they'll say, okay, now it's a new era. It's a new era, as opposed to where we would say, well, it goes up, constantly is going up. So the inflation does exist, but more as opposed to just like, okay, there's 1979 prices, 1985 prices, 1992 prices. For them, it's going to be more about eras. They'll say, oh, at the desert time, it's going to be X. At this time, it's going to be X, or they'll associate it with different places. But there is an acknowledgement of a change that's taking place, but they're not losing sight of what was as well at the same time. Okay? So, good. So let's see. Okay, so again, Rav Yochanan ben Broka said it is going to be 4 sa, which is a punjan, a bread which is purchased for a punjan when 4 sa of grain are purchased for 1 sela. Sela is a coin. And Rav Shimon says that the bread that is needed for an Eruv is 2 parts, okay, or we'll call a third of a loaf when there are 3 to a kav. Okay, so the bottom line is this is the way they're each describing it, and the Gemara says Tana, the Brisa says Ukrovim devreim lios shavin, that their 2 views, Rav Yochanan and Rav Shimon, are very close. They're not identical, but they're very close. So midami, the Gemara says, is it so that they're identical? Rav Yochanan arba sudas lekaba, based on Rav Yochanan's measurements. Again, trust the Gemara, because don't trust me, but trust the Gemara. That's 4 meals for a kav. Okay, a kav is a measurement, and Rav Shimon teisha sudas lekaba. According to Rav Shimon's quantity, it's going to be 9 meals for every kav. Okay, so that's a huge gap. Don't tell me that they're similar. Rav Shimon is double. So Rav Chisda tzemihan shlish lechenveni. Rav Chisda says, no, you're missing something because 1 pundyan is going to actually be taken out to pay the grocer. When we're talking about the measurement, the amount, it's not only the amount we have to keep in mind is the fact that there's also a portion taken out for the grocer, and therefore what comes out is that there's the amount of a loaf that's bought for a pundyan is actually diminished in size by a third because a part of the portion was used to pay the grocer. Vakati lamar tisha lamar sheis. So based on these measurements, you've brought it down a little bit, but we end up having is that according to Rav Shimon, there are going to be 9 meals for a kav. Rav Yochanan is going to have 6 meals for a kav. Okay, so you brought it down a little bit, but you still did not bring it down fully. So Elaki idach Rav Chisda. So we say, oh, there's another statement to Rav Chisda. Rav Chisda martzei mehen mechza lechanveni. Rav Chisda elsewhere said, don't take a third away, but rather take a half of the punjan paid for the loaf for the baker, meaning a half of it is the profit of the baker, and we're going to ignore that amount. Okay, so doing the math, what comes out based on this math is, according to Rav Shimon, there are 9 meals in a kav. According to Rav Yochanan, there are 8 meals in a kav. There is still a gap. And the Gemara says, you're right. That's what the Bryce said. The Bryce didn't say they're identical. It said they are close to being identical, and therefore there's no discrepancy. Okay, so now we've understood the Bryce. What is the takeaway? The takeaway is, first of all, just to tell us, first of all, that you're taking about the measurements for the payments, in terms of making the measurements to know exactly how to understand what each of them, to understand the final numbers, you need to know, by knowing that they're close, you now know to remove the amount that is being used for the chenveni, for the store owner, and therefore we can know the proper amount, as opposed to, fine. Says the Gemara, wait a second, Kash Rav Chisda Rav Chisda. So once, on the one hand, Rav Chisda told us that the grocers get paid a half. On the other hand, he told us they get paid a third. So which one is it? How much do grocers get paid? So lokasha hadaka yai balabais tzivi, hadlo yai balabais tzivi. The difference is whether or not the homeowner gave wood to the baker to bake. In other words, back in the day, payments was done a little bit differently than things are done today. Now you walk into the store, you just pay. You don't have to worry about the whole process behind it. But back in the day, there'd be 2 prices. When you come to the baker, and you come to the baker in the morning, you say, I want to have 2 loaves of bread for my meal tonight. Okay, can you please bake me 2 loaves of bread? Sure. Do you want to give me some wood to burn, and therefore I'm going to charge one amount? Or do you want me to use my own wood? I'll charge you a different amount. And therefore, on one hand, he says a half. One hand, he says a third. It depends on whether or not he gave wood in order to burn. Okay, says the Gemara further. 82b4. Again, the Mishnah told us, and the Mishnah said that half of the loaf is for a house afflicted with tsaras, and half of it is to render the body puzzle. So if you what?
Where did that come from?
Where did the measurements come from? Why did the Mishnah do this? So the Mishnah went on a tangent. The Mishnah was talking about measurements of bread, and basically talked about a half a pras. Half a pras is the half of a loaf of bread, and then it said that that half of the loaf of bread is the measurement based on psukim, based on what the normal amount to eat is, based on psukim as to how much bread has to be. The Gemara talks about being in a bais of nuga, a house which is afflicted with tsaras, and says if you're there for a certain amount of time, based on the Gemara in Shabbos actually went through this. The Gemara says if you're there for a certain amount of time, okay, then you're going to be tamei. What's that certain amount of time? The amount of time it takes to eat half a pras. Okay, fine. So that's just a tangent. And then the Mishnah continued and said, once we're talking about half a pras and half a pras, so we're going to say, and half of that is the amount of bread eaten, that if you eat a certain amount of tamei bread, then you are going to be tamei. In other words, if you have a crumb of tamei bread, it doesn't impact your body. But if you have half of that half amount that was mentioned earlier, then you do become tamei. Okay.
The question I was asked is why all of a sudden they talk about suras?
Because and Tuma, we're just going on once we're talking about half loaves, we're just using here's a tangent about half loaves. It's a tangent, it's a pure tangent. 83a1, Tatan the Brisa taught, the chatzia, a half of a half of a half, meaning an eighth of it, okay, is litame tumas ochlin. Is that if food is tamei, then and it's that amount, meaning a half, 1/8, then it's going to touch other food. It's enough to cause other food to become tamei. Whereas if it's like a 16th or a 10th, it's too small. It won't cause other food to become tamei. Okay, says the Gemara, "V'tani done my time l'tani tumas ochlin." So our Tana. So once we went on the tangent, why don't we keep on going on the tangents? In other words, the Brisa at least is consistent on its tangent. It goes, okay, half of the measure we're talking about is for X. The half of that is for Y. And then it stops. The Brisa says X, Y, and Z. Why don't we go into Z as well? Like, why is our Brisa stopping? So the Gemara says, Mishum lo shavu shi'urayu ladadi, because the quantities are not real, not fully a half, as we're about to see. In other words, the Brisa is a little bit looser on its measurements, and therefore our Mishnah does not want to mention the half, meaning the 1/8, because the measurement is not identical. We'll see what that means. Let's see. Titania was talking to the Brisa. Kama shir chati pras. What is the quantity of a half a pras, which we've been talking about? A pras is a half loaf. Okay, so the measurements we've been talking about is a half a pras, meaning the half a loaf. What's the measurement? Okay, which is going to make the body puzzle. So beitzim chaser kima. So the volume is 2 eggs minus an insignificant amount. Okay, so everyone's going to assume there's 2 eggs. The question is, are they exact eggs? Are they not exact eggs? And I mean, there's a Masorah, there's 2 eggs. The question is, how do you measure those eggs? So Rabbi Yehuda says it's 2 eggs minus the insignificant amount. Rabbi Yossi Omer Shtei Beitzim Sochakos. Rabbi Yossi says the opposite. Everyone understands that there's a tradition that it's not exactly 2 eggs. The question is, in which direction? Rabbi Yehuda says that it's a little bit less than 2 eggs. Rabbi Yossi says it's 2 loose eggs. Remember Sochakos from the just tangent, and not an important tangent, and that is Sochakos literally also means like tzchok, means to laugh. So whenever you want to say something is loose, you actually say the word laughter, because when we laugh, when we're happy, we actually feel a little bit looser. We don't feel as, and physically sometimes people, you sometimes swell. But so the bottom line is the term sochakos means loosely measured. So again, Rav Yehuda says it's a little bit less than 2 eggs. Rav Yehuda says a little bit more. And then side point, Shir Rebbe Shtei Beitzim V'od. Rebbe measured and found that the volume of 2 eggs, the measurement in his place. In other words, there is a sah measurement that was used in Rebbe's time, and he measured it, and it came out to 2 eggs plus. Okay, 1/20th of an egg. In other words, basically in Rebbe's time there was a measurement called a sah, and it's understood to be based on the eggs. So Rebbe went ahead and said, okay, well, how much is the sah that everyone's been using? In other words, you buy the measuring cups in the store. Okay, sah, and he says, well, I want to know what it's actually equivalent to, and he measured and it came out to 2 eggs plus, which is actually equivalent to the view of Rav Yossi. Okay, says the Gemara, V'ilu gabe tumas ochlin, which is the smaller amount. Remember, so we just established what the amount is for tumas, which is the amount to make a body puzzle, which is the last measurement mentioned in our Mishnah. Now again, the Brisa, which we quoted above, also mentions the measurement for making food tameh. And now we're going to talk about what that measurement is. So Rav Nasan Rav Dosi Amru, Kevetza Shamru Kamo V'Klipasa. He says the measurement is an egg with its shell. The chamram kamoa below klipasa, and they said it's a measurement without its shell. Okay, so bottom line is that the next measurement, the 8th measurement, is either going to be an egg with its shell, or it's going to be an egg without its shell. Okay, but the bottom line is that's not going to be a full half, a perfect half of the measurements above. In other words, the measurements above were either, let's say, with Rav Yehuda, was a little bit less than 2 eggs. So if you divide a little bit less than 2 eggs, it is not going to be 1 egg. It's certainly not going to be 1 egg with a shell. So the Gemara therefore says the reason the Brisa the reason the Mishnah did not mention the Z, the 3rd measurement, is because it's not a perfect half of the measurements above. Okay, so at least, in other words, there's at least consistency. It's not like there's a halachic reason. There's no debate between the Mishnah and the Brisa. It's just that the Mishnah wanted to say, basically like measurement, half that measurement and half that measurement. Measurement and half that measurement. Yeah, measurement, half that measurement and half that measurement. And the Brisa goes 1 more. But the reason the Mishnah doesn't go the 1 more is because it's not really accurate to say it's half of the last measurement. It's a little bit off, and therefore the Mishnah doesn't want to do so. Okay, fine. Says the Gemara further.
How the Brisa would be a little bit.
The Brises in general are a little bit looser than the Mishnah is. Yeah, so there is some consistency there. Okay, fine. The Gemara now lists another measurement for half a pras. We just saw 2 opinions, Rav Yehuda and Rav Yossi. Now we're going to have a 3rd opinion. Amar Rav from Rav Papa Rav Chizah Zod Rav Yehuda Rav Yossi. Okay, those are the opinions above of Rav Yehuda and Rav Yossi. Aval Chachamim Omrim Kebeitzo Mechza Sochakos. The measurement of half a pras is 1.5 loose eggs. Uman Chachamim, Rav Yochanan ben Broka, and this matches up with Rav Yochanan ben Broka, which we established above is 1.5 eggs. Okay, Rav Yochanan ben Broka was the Tana of our Mishnah over here. Gemara says Pshita. We know that Rav Yochanan ben Broka is 1.5 eggs. We saw that measurement above. So 83.82. The Gemara says Sochkas Aslash Minan. The Rav from is coming to add by saying it's Rav Yochanan ben Broka is that the measurement of Rav Yochanan ben Broka is not just 1.5. Bless you. It's 1.5 loose eggs. Okay, fine. Kiyas Rav Dimi Amar. When Rav Dimi came from Eretz Yisrael, he said the following: Shiger Bonios the Rebbe Modia de Kundis Zebin Neusa. Bonios, okay, we don't know, some guy once sent Rebbe a kundis. A kundis is another word for a sa, measure of Neusa. Neusa is a place. Okay, so he sent him again. There are all these measurements. We have these, in each. You go to the store, they say, this is a sa. In other words, again, they'll have like the measuring cups, this is a sa. Now, he sent him what a sa was in a place called Neusa. So Neusa, they had the sa measurement, the cups, it's a Neusa, made in Neusa, and it has the sa measurement. And Rebbe goes ahead, and Rebbe being curious, and it's important to know what the measurements are for each thing. Bashir Rebbe, Masan Shva Esrei Bayan. Rebbe measured it and found that this sa came out to 217 eggs. Okay, fine. So the Gemara now is going to go ahead and try to understand where this measurement comes from. Hasa dehecha. Okay, this sa, which type of sa measure did it belong to? And this gets into the inflation question, which you talked about.
It's strange, by the way, that the eggs are the unit of measurement, because 217 eggs, if you measure 217 eggs 3 different times, you're surely going to get 3 different measurements.
Fair. Okay, there's going to be some discrepancy, presumably. That's fair. That's fair. Just because the eggs are going to be, yeah, fair. Okay.
My grandparents cooked it.
With eggs, actual egg measurements.
That's how they, that's
Interesting.
how they measured, challah and measured their baking was eggs.
Interesting. Okay. So I guess it wasn't that long ago that that's the sun. Fascinating. Okay.
Not that you ever have measurements like.
Right. They didn't have the measuring cups that we do. Okay. So even So if you use the desert type of a sum measure, it's going to be 144 eggs. Vidur shalmis, which is a later period, i.e. inflation. Okay, in other words, the desert meaning there's an initial measurement, which is called the desert measurement. Meaning when the Jewish people started measuring, that was in the desert. Okay, so therefore it's going to be 144 eggs. Okay, that's going to be a sa. If you use the Yerushalmi measurement, i.e. a later period of time, then it's 173. And there's a later period, which is known as the Tzipori period, which is the Tziporin type, which is 207 eggs. Bottom line is, he says 217 eggs, and so even if there's a slight discrepancy, 216, 217, which would be normal, that's still not going to match up. So Gemara says the Olam Tziporis. Really, he was using the Tzipori measure. I see Chalsa Shadi Alayu. But what you forgot to do is take the Chala measurement, which we're going to assume to take, which is 1/24th of the entire thing, and that would narrow it down, right? And then you add the Chala measurement, which would be taken from such a Chala, and therefore it's going to be a little bit more, and that should help us with the measurement. The Gemara says, wait, Chalsa Kamya Hava Tamne. If you do the math, again, of it being a 1/24th, it's going to be 8 eggs and a katzi batzer lay. It's still going to fall short because 207 plus 8 is 215. So Gemara says, odos de Rebbe shtei alayhu. Remember earlier, Rebbe said when he measures he adds a 1/20th. Remember, Rebbe measured, and it came out that it wasn't 2 eggs; it was 2 eggs and a little bit. So the point is there. And what was the little bit? It was 1/20th. And so that's what we said. Yes, the earlier, right, when Rebbe, remember that discussion, Rebbe Yehuda and Rebbe Yossi. Then Rebbe measured, and it was 2 eggs plus. So the 2 eggs plus was 1/20th. So 1/20th, if you look to the nearest round number of 207, is the nearest round number is 20, and 1/20th is 10. So. Right? So now basically what you have is 207 plus 10 is 217, and that is your measurement. Ask the Gemara, but that's not a very fair, that's only because I'm bad at math. So what I did is I went ahead, instead of measuring 1/20th of 207, I measured 1/20th of 200 and came to 10. But if you measure of 207, you actually have a little bit more of 1/20th of 7, right? So, yeah, but the little more is not the amount of an egg volume, and since we're measuring in eggs, and it's a little less than an egg volume, we ignore it. Okay, says the Gemara further, 83a3. Let's see if we can get to the Mishnah. Tan Rabbanan. So are you Shamis? Okay, we're getting it enough, I think. Okay, even though we're not getting the exact numbers, Jesse has all the numbers. They're rolling in his head. But for the rest of us, okay. The Jerusalem Sa is larger than the desert Sa by a 6. Special Tzipor Sera al Yerushalayim Sus, and the Tzipor Sa exceeds the Yerushalmi Sa by a 6. Nimsa Shol Tzipor Sera al Midbar Shlish. What comes out is the Tzipori Sa is more than the desert Sa by a 1/3. And the Gemara says Shlish Deman, a 1/3 of what? We just mentioned a whole bunch of different. It's not just the measurements are all different over here. There's Yerushalmi, there's Midbaris Sa. So a 1/3 of what? Ilam Shlish to Midbaris. If you want to say it's a 1/3 more based on the desert Sa, that's not true. Mechli Shlish to Midbaris Kama Havar Samya. What is a 1/3 of the desert Sa? 48 eggs. Vilu Odfa Shis and Slas. But the excess of Tzipori Sa of the desert Sa is 63 volume eggs. Okay, so basically that can't be. Vela Shlish Yerushalmi. Want to say it's a 1/3 of the Yerushalmi Sa? Shlish Dida Kama Havi Chamshin Usamna Nechid Tilsa comes out to 57 and 2/3 of eggs. Vilu Odfa Shisin Uslas. But the excess of Tzipori Sa over desert Sa is 63 eggs. Again, we're not going to go through the math, but we'll just trust it. Vela Tzipori. So you want to tell me that it's a 1/3 of the Tzipori Sa. Shlish Dida Kama Havi Shiva Nechichada. How much is the 1/3 of the Tzipori Sa? It's 70 eggs. Meaning 69 eggs. Vilu odfa shitin slas. But the excess of the Tzipori Sa over desert Sa is 63 eggs. Still, nothing's matching up. What the way to read the Bryce is to say that the Tzipori Sa exceeds the desert Sa by close to a 1/3 of itself. And a 1/3 of itself is close to 1/2 of a desert Sa. He's reading a lot in into those words, and that would the math would match up. Asking my maskler Ravina, midi karv tani. The Bryce doesn't say close and then close, that you can read that all in. You're reading too much into it. Elamar Ravina hachigama. This is what it means. Nimtze shlish shlipori biva odio shel Rebbe yiser al mechza shel dimibar shlish ubeitza. What it means is that the third of the tipori sa, okay, which once you add the extra, i.e. the 1/20th of Rebbe, okay, because that was his measurement, the egg volume is only going to have 1/20th extra, is half of the desert sa by a third of an egg volume, okay? And then the math would match up, and that's what the brisa means. Okay, so the bottom line is, again, but I think what we would take out of this, and to Jesse's point, we want to highlight is the fact that the measurements changed over time. They start off in the desert, there's one measurement, and then as time goes on, what we'll call inflation is the Jerusalem period, and then there is the Tzipori period, and it grows during that time. And fine, and the Brisa wanted us to understand the relationship between the two based on the math using the Rebbe Ve'od math. Okay.
So for argument's sake, what's the measurement? I won't even, never mind.
Tan Rabbanan, we learned the Brisa, Reish Zariso Seichem. Now one last thing, okay, then we're done for these mathematical equations. The pasuk says Reish Zariso Seichem, which is the first of your does, which is the amount of challah. So what is the amount of challah? Kedei asiso seichem. The amount that you take is as your does. Okay, what does that mean? The kamni sosechem kidei isa samidbar. Okay, how large are your does? Okay, Hashem is speaking to the people in the desert. It's the measurement of the people in the desert. V'kama isa midbar. And how much is the dough of the people in the desert? Dechsiv va'omer. Okay, va'omer asira se'efahu. Okay, the pasuk tells us that the omer is 1/10 of the ephah. Okay, and therefore, what comes out is that the size of the desert dough was 3/10 of a sa. Based on the math, is the omer is 1/10 of the ephah. That equals 3/10 of a sa, and that's how much is going to be taken for challah mikan amru. And this is where they get the halachas that shiva revaim kamach va'od chayeves bechallah. Based on this math, 7/4 of a kav of flour plus a fraction of flour is subject to challah. Shehin shisha shel Yerushalmis, which comes out to 6 Yerushalmi rovas. Okay, shehin chamish shel tzipor, which are 5 of tzipori. Bottom line is, in modern pounds, because we don't use Yerushalmi, tzipori, or midbaris, in modern pounds, this is a big discussion. Is it 2.6 pounds of flour or 5 pounds of flour? The bottom line is, the star case psak is that if you use anything over 2.6 pounds of flour, based on this Gemara, okay, based on the math, you're going to be mafresh challah without a bracha. But if it's 5 pounds of challah, so if you use a little bit over half a typical bag of flour, you're going to take off challah without a bracha. If you use 5 pounds, you're going to take off challah with a bracha. Okay.
How do you fit it all in the oven? I can't fit it all in.
You don't fit it all in the oven at once. It's fine. And first of all, get a bigger oven. The bottom line is, yeah, you could make it. Wait, everyone has a fleshig, milchig, and parv oven. Okay, so fine. So the bottom line is, mikan amru, from here you see. So the whole thing is that the measurement is your amount of dough. So the Torah is telling us, like, what is a normal amount of a person should be eating, right? By saying this is your amount of dough, you also can learn, like, how the Torah endorses, like, what level of food. And therefore, ochal kimida zo, if a person eats this amount, which is the measurement from challah, harizeh bari mavorach, that's a healthy person. The Torah is saying this is like a normal thing. Again, the pasuk says, ariso seichem, your dough should be taken. That means that it's a measurement that is eaten. So what you see from here is that this is the amount that's taken for challah is going to be seen as an amount that should be eaten by you. That seems to be saying this, endorsing this is a good amount of food. And therefore the challah measurement that's taken, which is not so large, by the way. Okay, so when you're thinking about the amount that you're serving for, for each person, for if you're putting a roll on someone's thing, if you put like a big loaf of bread, not good. Ariso seichem would be a very small amount. That is seen as a healthy and blessed amount. Yasser al-kain raftan, you more than the amount which is separated as challah, you are a glutton. Pachos mikan mekulka b'me'av, if a person eats less than this, then you are defective. Wow, strong word. But basically, you should be eating more. You shouldn't be eating so little.
So the amount we came for challah, I'm a little confused. Is it or is it not subject to inflation? And if it is subject to inflation, then why has